Watching my son Daniel's face turn white as he realized that the confused old woman who needed to be kept in the attic had just sold his childhood home for $2.3 million cash to a tech executive, and that the mother he thought was financially dependent on him had been sitting on a real estate empire worth over $8 million that she'd been quietly building for the past 15 years. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because what happened next will shock you even more than what I'm about to reveal. The sold sign went up in front of the pristine Colonial on Elmwood Drive in Newton, Massachusetts on a crisp October morning, exactly 48 hours after my 45-year-old son Daniel had informed me that the attic would be perfectly suitable for someone in my current situation. Standing on the sidewalk watching the real estate agent hammer that sign into the manicured front lawn, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in the 2 years since my husband Robert's death. The house that Daniel thought he would inherit, the house where he'd assumed I would live quietly in the cramped attic space while he and his family enjoyed the main floors, had just been sold to the highest bidder without a moment's hesitation. At 70 years old, Eleanor Ellie Hartwell had just made the most expensive point of her life. Never underestimate a woman who's been building wealth while you thought she was just baking cookies and tending gardens. The moving truck would arrive next week to collect my belongings, not to transport them to some assisted living facility or relative's spare room, but to my new 4,000-square-foot waterfront home in Martha's Vineyard that I'd purchased with cash 3 months earlier, while Daniel was still trying to figure out how to manage Mom's declining finances. But watching my son Daniel's face turn white as he realized that the confused old woman who needed to be kept in the attic had just sold his childhood home for $2.3 million cash to a tech executive, and that the mother he thought was financially dependent on him had been sitting on a real estate empire worth over $8 million that she'd been quietly building for the past 15 years. That moment made every second of his condescending treatment worth it. The phone call I was about to make to my son would shatter everything he thought he knew about his mother's capabilities, her resources, and her willingness to accept his version of what was appropriate for a 70-year-old widow. But to understand how Daniel could have been so spectacularly wrong about the woman who raised him, you need to understand the systematic campaign he'd waged over the past 18 months to convince me, and everyone else, that Eleanor Hartwell was no longer capable of managing her own life. The conversation that had led to this moment had taken place just 3 days earlier, on a Sunday afternoon that had started like any other family dinner, but ended with my son essentially offering me charity housing in his attic. Daniel had arrived with his wife Jennifer and their twin 16-year-old daughters, Madison and Mackenzie, ostensibly for our weekly family gathering, but actually for what he'd later described to his friends as a necessary intervention to help Mom face reality. I'd spent the morning preparing Robert's famous pot roast, a recipe I'd been perfecting for 45 years and could make blindfolded. The dining room table was set with our good china, fresh flowers from my prize-winning garden graced the centerpiece, and the house was immaculate as always. Every detail reflected the care and attention I'd been putting into maintaining our family home since Robert's death 2 years earlier. But as Daniel walked through the front door that afternoon, scanning the rooms with the critical eye of someone looking for problems rather than appreciating beauty, I realized that he wasn't seeing any of the evidence of my competence and capability that filled every corner of our home. Instead, he was building a case for why his mother couldn't be trusted to live independently. "Mom, we need to talk about your living situation," Daniel had begun after dinner, settling into the leather chair that had been his father's favorite spot. His tone was gentle but firm, the same voice he probably used when explaining to his teenage daughters why they couldn't have something they wanted. "This house is way too big for one person, and frankly, the maintenance and expenses are becoming more than you can handle." I'd looked around the immaculate living room, fresh flowers from my own garden on the mantel, not a speck of dust anywhere, hardwood floors that gleamed from my weekly polishing, windows that sparkled because I'd had them professionally cleaned just the week before. Every system in the house was functioning perfectly, thanks to my carefully maintained network of service providers, contractors, and specialists who'd been helping me manage this property for years. "What exactly about my handling of the situation seems inadequate to you?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about what evidence he was seeing that I was missing. "Mom, you're 70 years old," Jennifer had chimed in with that particular tone wives use. When they're delivering messages, their husbands don't have the courage to say directly. "This place has 3 floors, a huge yard, and all those stairs. What if you fall? What if something major breaks and you can't afford to fix it? What if you have a medical emergency and there's no one here to help you? What if something breaks and I can't afford to fix it?" The irony was almost amusing. If only they had known that the woman they were lecturing about financial responsibility had liquid assets that exceeded their combined net worth by a factor of 10, and that I'd been successfully managing property maintenance, renovations, and improvements for decades while they struggled to keep up with their own mortgage payments. "I appreciate your concern," I'd said carefully, "but I'm not ready to make any major changes to my living situation. I love this house, I'm comfortable here, and I'm perfectly capable of maintaining it." "But Mom, that's exactly the problem," Daniel had pressed, leaning forward with the earnest expression he'd worn since childhood when he was trying to convince me of something. "You think you're capable of maintaining this place, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. The financial burden, the physical demands, the isolation, it's all adding up to a situation that's becoming unsustainable." Unsustainable. The word hung in the air like an accusation. My life, according to my son, was unsustainable. That's when Daniel had pulled out the folder. Because apparently, treating your mother like an incompetent tenant required documentation, spreadsheets, and what he probably thought was compelling evidence. "Mom, we've been doing some research, and we think the best solution would be for you to move in with us permanently," he'd announced, opening the folder to reveal printed pages covered with his handwriting, highlighted sections, and what looked suspiciously like a PowerPoint presentation that had been converted to paper format. "Madison and Mackenzie are busy with college prep and will be leaving for university soon, so they won't be home much longer. You could have the attic space. We've already looked into converting it into a nice little apartment for you. It would be perfect for your needs." The attic space. He was offering me the attic space in a house I'd helped them buy with a $75,000 down payment that had come from the profits of my first major real estate investment that they knew nothing about. The same attic where Jennifer currently stored her seasonal decorations, Daniel's old college textbooks, and boxes of the girls' childhood belongings they couldn't bear to donate. "It would be perfect for your needs," Jennifer had continued, as if she were describing a luxury resort rather than relegating me to the space above their heads where I would be out of sight and, presumably, out of mind. "It's quiet, private, and you'd have access to the main house whenever you wanted to visit with the family. Visit with the family. In the home where I would be living, as if my presence in their daily lives would be an intrusion rather than a natural part of a multi-generational household. The space is actually quite large," Daniel had added, consulting his notes again. "About 600 square feet once we finish it properly. We could install a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and there's room for a sitting area plus sleeping space. You'd have everything you need. Everything I need." They had reduced my needs to 600 square feet of converted storage space, as if 7 decades of life could be efficiently compressed into an attic apartment that would keep me conveniently contained while they lived their lives in the spacious rooms below. "What about this house?" I'd asked, gesturing around the living room where we'd celebrated Daniel's birthdays, where he'd brought Jennifer to meet us for the first time, where Madison and Mackenzie had taken their first steps and said their first words. "Well," Daniel had said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering news they thought was particularly clever, "we think the smartest thing would be to sell it and use the proceeds to help supplement your living expenses and cover the costs of converting the attic space for you. Supplement my living expenses." They had no idea that my living expenses were already supplemented by rental income from 3 investment properties, dividend payments from a carefully curated stock portfolio, and the profits from a small business I'd been running quietly for the past 3 years. "The real estate market is strong right now," Jennifer had added, clearly pleased with their research and planning. "And a house this size in this neighborhood should sell quickly. We've already spoken to a real estate agent who thinks we could list it for around $850,000, maybe $900,000 if we're lucky and find the right buyer." If we're lucky. The house they thought might sell for $900,000 if they were fortunate had already been appraised at $1.8 million by the assessor for my insurance company, and I knew from my own extensive research that similar properties in our neighborhood had been selling for well over $2 million. The colonial 2 streets over, with fewer upgrades and a smaller lot, had sold just last month for $2.1 million. But then again, Daniel and Jennifer had never paid attention to real estate trends, property, values, or investment strategies. They'd been too busy with their own lives to notice that the woman they were trying to manage had been studying these markets for years, attending real estate investment seminars, and building relationships with agents, contractors, and financial advisors who respected her business acumen. "We think this plan addresses all your major concerns," Daniel had continued, clearly warming to his presentation. "You'll have security, family nearby, no maintenance responsibilities, and enough money from the house sale to live comfortably for the rest of your life." The rest of my life. As if at 70, I was supposed to be winding down, accepting limitations, and grateful for whatever accommodations my children chose to provide, rather than continuing to build, create, and pursue my own vision of what my future could look like. "I need to think about this," I'd said, though I already knew exactly what my response would be. "Of course, Mom. Take all the time you need," Daniel had replied with false magnanimity. "But we really think this is the best solution for everyone. You'll be safe, we'll have peace of mind, and the girls will love having their grandmother so close by." The best solution for everyone. Code for the solution that would give them control over my living situation, access to what they assumed were my limited resources, and the satisfaction of having solved the problem of their aging mother without actually having to accommodate my preferences or respect my autonomy. Jennifer had gathered up their papers and folders while Daniel explained the timeline they had in mind. "We're thinking we could start the conversion process in the next few weeks, list your house in early spring when the market picks up, and have you moved in with us by summer. It's perfect timing." Perfect timing. For them, perhaps. For me, it was the perfect moment to demonstrate exactly how wrong they were about every assumption they'd made regarding my capabilities, my resources, and my willingness to accept their version of what was appropriate for my life. That night, lying in the master bedroom of the house I'd shared with Robert for 32 years, the room where we'd planned our financial future, discussed our investment strategies, and built the wealth that our son assumed didn't exist, I'd made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to think about their proposal. I wasn't going to negotiate the terms of my surrender. I wasn't going to spend weeks pretending to consider their offer while they pressured me to accept their vision of my future. And I certainly wasn't going to allow myself to be relegated to attic living in a house I'd helped them afford while they controlled my assets and managed my decline. I was going to show them exactly what their mother was capable of when she stopped seeking their approval and started using the resources they had no idea she possessed. The next morning, Monday, I'd made the first of 2 phone calls that would shatter every assumption Daniel and Jennifer had about my financial situation, my decision-making abilities, and my willingness to accept their management of my life. The first call was to Rebecca Martinez, the top real estate agent in Newton, and a woman I'd been quietly consulting with for months about property values, market timing, and investment opportunities in our area. Rebecca was the kind of professional who dealt exclusively with high net worth clients and properties that commanded premium prices. She was also someone who had recognized immediately that Eleanor Hartwell was a serious player in the real estate market, not a confused elderly woman who needed help understanding basic property transactions. "Rebecca, it's Eleanor Hartwell. I'm ready to list the house on Elmwood Drive. I want to move quickly, and I want to price it to sell fast but at full market value." "Eleanor, I've been waiting for this call," Rebecca had replied with the enthusiasm of someone who understood exactly what kind of property we were discussing. "Based on recent comparables and the current market conditions, I think we should list at $2.1 million. With your property's condition, location, and the upgrades you've made over the years, I expect multiple offers within the first week." $2.1 million. More than double what Daniel and Jennifer thought the house was worth, and exactly in line with what I'd been expecting based on my own research and the informal appraisal I'd commissioned 6 months earlier. "What's your timeline for showing?" I'd asked. "I can have professional photos taken today, staging completed by Wednesday, and the listing live by Thursday morning. If you're serious about moving quickly, we'll have this sold within 2 weeks." The second call was to James Chen at Hartwell & Associates, the wealth management firm I'd been working with since Robert's death to grow and diversify the assets my son assumed didn't exist. James was the financial advisor who'd helped me understand that the modest lifestyle Robert and I had maintained during our marriage was supported by investments and business ventures that had grown substantially over the decades, particularly in the 2 years since I'd taken active control of our portfolio. "James, I'm moving forward with the Martha's Vineyard purchase. Wire the funds today. And James, it's time to update my estate planning documents. I have some changes to make regarding my primary beneficiary." "Absolutely, Eleanor. The Vineyard property is an excellent investment, and given the current market conditions, you're buying at exactly the right time. Should I arrange for the interior designer to start planning the renovations you discussed?" "Yes. Let's move forward with everything. I want the house ready for occupancy within 6 weeks." By Tuesday morning, Rebecca's team was at the house taking professional photographs that would showcase every detail of the property I'd been lovingly maintaining for over 3 decades. By Wednesday afternoon, staging specialists were arranging furniture and accessories to highlight the home's architectural features and the extensive renovations I'd overseen during the past 2 years. By Thursday morning, the listing was live on every major real estate platform with a price tag of $2.1 million and photographs that made the house look like something from Architectural Digest. By Thursday evening, Rebecca was fielding calls from buyers' agents whose clients were ready to schedule immediate showings. By Friday afternoon, we had the first offer, $2.05 million all cash, 30-day close. By Saturday evening, a bidding war had erupted between 3 serious buyers who recognized that this was exactly the kind of property that rarely came on the market in Newton. By Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after Daniel had suggested I consider attic living, I was reviewing the final offers with Rebecca and preparing to accept the highest bid. The winning offer, $2.3 million, all cash, 15-day close, from a tech executive who'd been looking for exactly this kind of property for his family and was willing to pay premium price to avoid a lengthy bidding process. The sale price was $1.4 million more than what Daniel and Jennifer thought the house was worth if we were lucky. Sunday afternoon, I made the phone call that would change everything Daniel thought he knew about his mother's financial situation and decision-making capabilities. "Daniel, it's Mom. I have some news about the house." "Oh, Mom, have you been thinking about our conversation? Because Jennifer and I have been looking at contractors for the attic conversion, and we think we can have everything ready for you by—" "Daniel, I've sold the house." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and confused, like a child who'd just been told that everything he thought he understood about the world was wrong. "Mom, what do you mean you sold the house? You can't just make a decision like this without consulting the family." "Daniel, the last time I checked, my name was the only one on the deed, and the last time we spoke, you made it very clear that—" You thought I should sell this house and use the proceeds for my living expenses. That's exactly what I'm doing. But we had a plan. We were going to help you through this process. We were going to manage everything so you didn't have to deal with the stress and complexity. Your plan involved me living in your attic and accepting whatever price your chosen real estate agent thought we might get if we were lucky. My plan involved working with the best agent in Newton and selling to the highest bidder at full market value. What do you mean, full market value? How much did you sell it for? $2.3 million cash, 15-day close. The silence that followed was even longer than the first one. I could practically hear Daniel's brain trying to process the fact that the house he thought was worth $900,000 on a good day had just sold for more than twice that amount. And that his supposedly financially incompetent mother had managed the entire transaction without his help or supervision. Mom, where are you going to live? I've purchased a home in Martha's Vineyard. Waterfront property, 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, with a guest cottage that will be perfect for when you and Jennifer want to visit. You purchased a home? With what money? How could you afford? He stopped mid-sentence, and I could hear the wheels turning as he began to realize that there were significant gaps in his understanding of his parents' financial situation. Daniel, your father and I built wealth for 45 years. We invested wisely, saved consistently, and made strategic decisions about real estate and business opportunities. The fact that you never bothered to learn about our financial situation doesn't mean we didn't have one. But you never said anything about having money. You never mentioned investments or business deals, or you never asked. You were too busy telling me what I couldn't afford and what I wasn't capable of managing to bother learning about what I actually owned or how I'd been handling my finances since your father's death. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Daniel alternating between shock, confusion, and what sounded suspiciously like resentment that his mother had turned out to be far more capable and financially secure than he'd believed. Mom, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us worry about your finances? I let you worry because you never asked about my actual situation. You assumed I was struggling financially and needed your help. And when I tried to explain that I was managing fine on my own, you interpreted my independence as confusion or denial. But we were just trying to help. You were trying to control. There's a difference, Daniel. The woman Daniel thought he was helping manage her decline was about to become the woman who would force him to reconsider every assumption he'd ever made about aging, capability, and the relationship between parents and adult children. The attic. Space he'd thought was suitable for his mother was about to become a metaphor for how small his vision of her had been. And the house sale that was supposed to solve his mother's financial problems was about to become the foundation for her most dramatic declaration of independence. The moving truck would arrive on Friday to transport my belongings to Martha's Vineyard, where I would begin the next chapter of my life, in a home that reflected my actual resources and preferences rather than my son's limitations and misconceptions. But tonight, sitting in this beautiful living room for the last time, I was savoring the satisfaction of a point perfectly made. The woman Daniel had underestimated was about to show him exactly what his mother was capable of when she stopped accepting his version of what was possible for someone her age, someone her gender, and someone he'd decided needed his management and protection. And it was going to be magnificent. What Daniel and Jennifer didn't know as they sat in their suburban living room that Sunday evening, congratulating themselves on having solved the mom problem with their attic solution, was that the woman they had just relegated to storage space was sitting on a real estate portfolio worth $8.3 million. While they worried about my ability to afford basic home maintenance, I owned 3 rental properties in Cambridge that generated $18,000 per month in passive income. While they fretted about my declining cognitive abilities, I had been successfully managing a property investment business that had outperformed the S&P 500 by 12% over the past 5 years. While they assumed I needed their financial guidance, I had liquid assets that could fund their children's college educations 3 times over without making a dent in my principal. But here's the thing about being systematically underestimated by your own family. You learn to keep your capabilities and resources private, because every time you've tried to share your successes in the past, they've found ways to diminish them, question your judgment, or suggest that you've been lucky rather than skillful. When Robert died 2 years ago, I had expected Daniel to support me through my grief while I transitioned from being half of a partnership to being a complete individual. What I got instead was a son who immediately positioned himself as the wise adult who needed to guide his confused elderly mother through every aspect of widowhood, from financial planning to social activities to basic life decisions. The truth was, Robert and I had been far more financially successful than Daniel realized, but our success had been built on careful planning, strategic investments, and a deliberately modest lifestyle that allowed us to accumulate wealth without drawing attention to our growing net worth. We'd learned early in our marriage that financial security came from living below your means and investing the difference, not from displaying your wealth through expensive cars, luxury vacations, or status symbols that impressed the neighbors. Robert had started his career as a mechanical engineer at Raytheon, but by the time he retired, he was consulting for defense contractors across New England and commanding fees that reflected his expertise in advanced manufacturing systems. More importantly, he had parlayed his technical knowledge into investments in companies whose innovations he understood better than most financial analysts. But I hadn't just been the supportive wife who managed the household while Robert built our fortune. I had been his business partner in every sense of the word, handling client development, contract negotiations, project management, and financial planning for over 2 decades. Many of our biggest consulting contracts had come through relationships I'd developed, proposals I'd written, and client management strategies I'd implemented. When Robert became ill 3 years ago, I had seamlessly taken over the business operations while caring for him. When he died, I hadn't lost my business partner. I had lost my collaborator, but I had retained all the knowledge, relationships, and capabilities that had made our partnership successful. Daniel had interpreted my temporary withdrawal from active business development as evidence that I had never been truly capable, that I had only functioned as an extension of Robert's talents. He had no idea that 6 months after Robert's funeral, I had quietly transformed our consulting practice into Eleanor Hartwell Property Solutions, a real estate investment and management company that specialized in identifying undervalued properties in emerging neighborhoods around Boston. My first major acquisition had been a 3-family house in Somerville that the previous owner was selling because he couldn't handle the challenges of being a landlord. The property was structurally sound but cosmetically tired, located in a neighborhood that was clearly on the verge of gentrification, but hadn't yet attracted the attention of major developers. I'd purchased the building for $485,000, invested $65,000 in strategic renovations that focused on modern kitchens and bathrooms while preserving the original character, and transformed it into 3 luxury rental units that commanded premium rents from young professionals who wanted to live close to Boston but couldn't afford downtown prices. Within 18 months, similar properties in the neighborhood were selling for over $700,000, and my renovated units were generating $6,400 per month in rental income against a monthly mortgage payment of $2,100. The property had become a cash-generating asset that also appreciated in value, providing both monthly income and long-term wealth building. But when I'd mentioned to Daniel that I was looking into some real estate opportunities, his response had been immediate concern about my ability to handle such complex financial decisions. "Mom, real estate investing is really complicated and risky," he'd said with the authority of someone who'd never owned anything more challenging than his own home. "There are a lot of people who target elderly investors with deals that sound good but end up being scams or money pits." When I'd tried to explain that I was working with reputable agents, conducting thorough due diligence, and focusing on properties with strong fundamentals in appreciating neighborhoods, he'd suggested that I was getting in over my head and should stick to simple, safe investments like CDs and treasury bonds. So I'd learned to keep my real estate activities private while Daniel continued to treat me like someone who needed protection from my own poor judgment. My second acquisition had been even more successful. An estate sale in Cambridge had presented an opportunity to purchase a Victorian duplex that had been owned by the same family for 60 years. The property was a time capsule of 1960s decorating choices and deferred maintenance, but the bones were solid and the location was prime, 3 blocks from Harvard Square and walking distance to the Red Line. The family was motivated to sell, quickly to settle the estate, and most potential buyers were intimidated by the amount of work required to modernize the property. I saw an opportunity to create something special while building wealth through forced appreciation. I'd purchased the duplex for $890,000, invested $180,000 in a comprehensive renovation that transformed it into 2 stunning luxury apartments, and leased both units